Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really tough and complex question. Why is it that so much of the religious violence we see today seems to be linked with one particular faith? We're going to break down the analysis presented in the Seekin Jigyasa video, Why Not Others?, which puts forward a pretty bold framework to try and answer that very question.
So, where does this whole investigation even start? Well, not with some abstract theory or a dusty old book. It actually starts with a very specific, very personal event that sparked a much bigger question.
It all kicked off with a close call for the video's creator right there, near a metro station in Delhi. And you know, a moment like that can really make you think. It led them to ask, was this just a random, isolated incident, or was it part of a much wider, global pattern?
So they started digging into the data and looking at terror attacks between 2020 and 2023. And this is important. They excluded state versus state conflicts. They found a pretty stark statistic. Out of 166 attacks, 111 of them were carried out by Islamic radical groups. And it's this number that really sets the stage for the entire analysis.
And that brings us to the absolute core question of the video. The goal here isn't about pointing fingers. It's about trying to understand why. All religions have evolved, so what is it about the specific theology and the history of these different faiths that might be leading to such different outcomes in our modern world?
Okay, so before presenting its own big idea, the video first does something really important. It addresses all the usual arguments and defenses you've probably heard a million times in this exact conversation.
And the source is quick to acknowledge that, yeah, on the surface, a lot of these points seem valid. Other religions do have violent verses. They do have founders who fought wars. They do try to get converts. But the video argues that if we just stop there, we're missing the real story. The crucial differences, it claims, are in the details, the stuff just below the surface.
So how do you get to those details in a systematic way? Well, the video proposes a system, a 5-point framework. Think of it like a toolkit, designed to compare these different theologies side by side to see where they really start to diverge. And this is it. This is the heart of the whole analysis. It's built on 5 simple questions. 1. Are there violent verses in the holy books? 2. Were the founders themselves violent? 3. Was that violence defensive, or was it about expansion? 4. Does the religion call for its own specific legal system for the state? And finally, number 5, is there a built-in way to philosophically reinterpret the old texts? The video's entire argument is that the answers to these 5 questions explain almost everything.
All right, this is where it gets really interesting. What actually happens when you take this 5-point framework and apply it to the world's major religions? Let's take a look at how it all shakes out.
So here it is, the big comparison table. Now just look at those first 2 columns, violent verses and leader violence. You see a lot of yes answers, right? The source does clarify that for Christianity, the no is specifically for the New Testament, or NT. But here's the thing. According to this analysis, the story completely changes as you move to the right. Look at offensive wars, state law, where Judaism gets a no for its modern form, and maybe most importantly, that last column, reinterpretation. That's where Islam in this framework ends up standing alone, and we're about to break down exactly why. Let's start with the nature of war. The source makes a really key distinction here. It argues that in faiths like Hinduism and Sikhism, wars were defensive. And even then, their morality was questioned, even by the winners. The Mahabharata famously ends with the victors filled with regret. But in contrast, the video argues that in early Islam, war became an accepted tool for expansion, where conquered people were given a very clear choice: convert, pay a special tax, or prepare for battle.
Okay, next up, state law. To make its point, the analysis brings in some modern data. A 2024 survey from the Henry Jackson Society found that 32%, almost a third, of British Muslims would support implementing Sharia law. The source uses this to argue that the desire for a theology-based legal system remains uniquely strong.
And now we get to what the video presents as the most critical point of all, reinterpretation. And Judaism is used as the key case study. See, after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, way back in 70 CE, the Jewish people lost everything: their state, their army, everything. Survival as a scattered minority became the #1 goal. And that intense pressure, the video argues, forced a deep philosophical reinterpretation of their scriptures. They had to adapt to survive.
And this quote from the Talmud just perfectly captures the result of that process. The really harsh punishments you might read about in the ancient texts, they weren't deleted. Instead, centuries of debate and reinterpretation made them almost impossible to actually carry out. A court that executed just one person in 70 years was considered bloody. Moderation was literally written into the legal tradition. Now, this source draws a really sharp contrast between that and the historical path of Islam. The motivation wasn't about surviving as a powerless minority. It was about governing a massive, rapidly growing empire. So the top priority became something totally different, preserving a single, pure, unchanged version of the Quran. This, the video argues, meant that the kind of deep, philosophical reinterpretation seen in Judaism was discouraged because the literal purity of the text was paramount. So, after walking through this whole 5-point framework, after all the comparisons, where does this leave us? What is the final conclusion of the video?
Well, it all comes down to what the source calls the cycle of power. It goes like this. First, a group uses a fundamentalist, pure version of their ideology to gain power. But then, once they're actually in charge, they have to moderate to keep things stable and prosperous. Think of the Ottoman Empire. But then, that moderation starts to look like corruption to a new group of fundamentalists, who then rise up to challenge them, and the whole cycle starts over. The video's conclusion is that, because of its unique theological structure, Islam provides a powerful, ready-made script for that first phase, the grab for power.
And that leaves us with a final, really provocative idea to think about. Is this pattern really just about religion, or is what we're seeing a fundamental cycle of history itself? Radical ideas are used to gain power, and then the realities of keeping that power force moderation. A constant push and pull that we see playing out not just in theology, but in politics and culture all around us every single day.